Hello. This is our scrim against our T1 team from Friday. I think today's Saturday. Who knows what time is really anymore at this point. But I really just tried to pick the map that kind of we had the most losses in, because I don't remember losing any of the maps, and I can't see the win loss in the VOD share, and since I'm not a player, I don't have access to them in my own replays. So this is my kind of best guess at the map we struggled the most on. So I'm going to use this time to talk about some specific things on 2CP, or not 2CP, this is Koth, sorry, on Koth, and small things that we can kind of work on. I'll of course go through pathing, because pathing is important on every map, so try to do your best to learn the different pathings and stuff like that. I believe we are going to be, yes, even though Team 2 is on the right side of the screen, we're coming from the left side of the screen. So the first thing that we want to talk about on Koth is how to control the point. Every map is going to be a little bit different, so on this one we're going to break it down into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sections, right? So of course we have point, right, that's the area which you actually have to stand on to have capture progress, and the part of the map that you actually want to be most focused on. Then you're going to have courtyard. That's that green area with grass right outside in between where the camera is and point. And then below that you're going to have lion statue. You can kind of call this different things. You could call this second courtyard if you really wanted to be confusing, or lantern because it's surrounded by lanterns. Any significant kind of like landmark feature that's specific to this area should be fine. I would go with calling it probably lantern, or in lantern courtyard or something like that. So you have point, courtyard, lantern. Then on the left and right side you'll see that we have two specific doorways that you come through, and thin strips of space right in front of them, and this is just choke, or at least one of the many chokes on this map. You can kind of break this map down into, I'm kind of looking around and trying to make sure that I get all of the different things correct so that I don't leave too much information out for you guys, but there's about 6 chokes on this map in general, so really you can hold the enemy team at any one of these chokes, but the problem is with most of the chokes is that the enemies don't have to go through them. So I'm going to start moving the camera around and showing you what I'm talking about as best I can, right? So if we're coming from our spawn, let's say, and we're moving on to point, you'll note that most people in your ranked games and that you've seen come through this doorway. This is just kind of the fastest way to get to point, unless you are Hammond or Lucio or Farah, who can come around coast side. Coast is always the edge that kind of just falls into nothingness and a backdrop on the map. So you see how there's water here. That's why we call it coast, because a lot of coast areas have water in the Overwatch maps. I'm sure there's a few that don't, but this is just a good reason to remember why it's called coast. It's just because there's almost always water, and coast overlook water. So most people come along this area because it's the fastest way to get to point. But you'll note that once you get to this point, it's kind of split on which way you'll wind up going. I know at least in my ranked games, I can't say for any higher elos, people will tend to kind of just fall apart in this section right here, because half the team wants to go to lantern and courtyard, and the other half of the team wants to go along coast to the point. But really neither of them is better than the other. They both have distinct advantages, right? You're going to have some compositions that are going to want to kind of come along coast side and get in very close to the point while having limited line of sight to the enemies. These are generally brawl comps that usually have close range characters with high damage outputs. So if you're running a brawl comp, you're going to want to generally go coast, but that means that brawl comps that go that way are susceptible to being booped by Hammonds, Lucios, Faras, etc. And if you go through courtyard and lantern, then you have longer sight lines, which are better for McCrees and Ashes and compositions that focus more on poke. But of course you have to be aware that you have to traverse further with the enemy being able to see you if they're holding point. Of course, both of those, like I said, are under the stipulation that they might be holding point. But you could see now, if you get into the defender's head, that you might not want to be holding point on this map because it gives the enemy options. And the options require the defensive team to constantly be on their toes. because the enemies can come from either side. If you're playing on defense, right, they can come from left and right. This is not a huge span of space. But one of the more punishing instances can be if you have an Orisa. Orisa's shield is on a cooldown, so she can't easily rotate between these two chokes. However, she can defend them if she's good enough. Reinhardt is a little bit easier, but even the rotation requires repositioning on the side of your team. If the enemy are coming from courtyard, your supports can kind of be sitting back here on this box back here. I'm going to call it, personally, I call it generator, because I feel like this would be somewhere where you put a generator. It's like in the backyard, you know, kind of just out here, but you could also call it benches if you want, I guess, because there's benches. So your supports can chill around here if the enemies are coming through courtyard, but if they're not coming through courtyard, then you kind of want to be rotating to the other side. Now, you never want to be splitting yourself from your own spawn, so technically, if we're defending and we're red right now, we would want to be rotating to over here. And these small things can kind of wind up messing teams up a lot of times, because rotations are so specific, right? If the supports go too early, which isn't usually an issue, but if the supports go too early, the tanks aren't set up and the supports can get picked by like a hit scan DPS or somebody who has high pick potential. If the tanks go a little bit too early, then the supports don't have the proper positioning and they break line of sight while the tanks are under pressure, and it causes problems for the tanks, right? If the DPS rotate too early, then they have the similar situation of the supports where they're out of position. But again, like I've said multiple times, the positioning for the DPS is a little bit more fluid than it is for the tanks and supports. Tanks and supports play around the map, the DPS play around their tanks and supports, and that's because each DPS is going to do their own thing and have their own spacing that they're going to want to work with, and some DPS are going to be so specific, like I can't tell you where Afara is supposed to, I can't tell you where every DPS is going to be, because Afara is going to want to be somewhere different from McCree. But if I was to take this instance, then Monkey and Boop playing on the McCree and Echo are going to be wanting to play that little mid-ground area between the tanks and supports, but while still using cover. So if the tanks, let's say, have to rotate to defend coast side, the DPS can take this flank route right here and hold this pillar as a sort of pseudo-defensive positioning, right? They can this can be their shield when their shields aren't there, and etc, etc, while the supports are a little bit further back. This also gives them access to, like I was saying, it gives them a little flank route that they can kind of quickly maneuver, and gives them enough space to kind of peel while being able to check down down into courtyard if they needed to. Let's say if somebody peeked from there. Now, something to be aware of again with your rotations is that rotations can be faked, and the enemy can also split. So if 4 split here, and then let's say a McCree Mercy comes down through courtyard as a DPS holding here, you have to be aware. You have to be able to be a look back and forth, keep tabs on all of their team, the enemy team, as much as you can, so that you know if something particular is happening. As you play against higher skilled players and you get higher in elo, people tend to get more predictable because they do the things that are optimal more often, which makes it easier to figure out what's going on sometimes. But you still need to be able to be aware and react to situations that are unpredictable, and be just kind of like as on point as possible so that you can snuff out unexpected situations earlier into the fight. So on defense, generally you're going to want to hold at this point right here, and let me go to the other side again because we are red. So you're going to want to hold at this choke up here, and this is because this is one of the few spaces that the enemies are almost definitely going to come through, and forcing them out of this spot puts them in a kind of disadvantaged situation. So if you hold here, the enemies can push into you, sure and well, but they're in a closed space, and choke has its advantages, where all of your DPS can kind of funnel in, and it doesn't matter if you miss a shot because you're likely to hit somebody kind of squished in behind everybody else. And big splash damage kind of does better in this area. So Echo sticky bombs, I'm sorry if you hear the horn outside, you know, if Hammond has mines in here, Orisa pull really gets a lot of value because it's easier to pull the full team together. So, you know, it has normal choke advantages. But if the enemies don't want to push you in here, they have to go left along this food courtyard here. And you could call this food court, or you could call this tables, I guess, or yellow. There's a lot of yellow in this room. I'd call it food court. But they can come around here and they can push you from this direction to try to make you, like I said, rotate and respond to them. So remember, if the enemies can do this, you can do this too. If you're trying to push out, you could always push out via the other side of food court and take advantage of the fact that the enemies might not notice you, especially if you come from this other door over here. Most people kind of funnel into this left door, forgetting that there's a whole right hand side to this map. There's even a mega over here. So you can kind of come along this right side, go to food court, and especially if you have poke compositions, this sight line is a little bit more advantageous. You can take advantage of slow rotations to try to pick people off, make the enemies maneuver and respond to you, and try to force kind of like situations that they might not find favorable. If you're pushing from here, always look for the next checkpoint, tanks. So this is going to be your next area, and this is very important for DPS and supports too, to kind of look for these checkpoints. Just I always say tanks because I say tanks in this situation because the tanks are going to be going first, right? So if you were here tanks, you want to be making that space, getting it so that your team can spread out and take different advantaged angles on the enemy, and you're going to want to use this line to kind of like be able to hide and reload your shields and get your cooldowns back, etc, etc. Tanks, once you move forward, you kind of want to either move forward here or start pushing coast. Different strategies. I would probably push through courtyard, because once you go along coast, there's really no purpose because you've already been in a poke battle. So unless you're really trying to go for some sort of fast rotation, let's say like we have a Lucio right now, you speed around the side, you try to catch them out. This is something you want to plan beforehand. You cannot simply say go left, speed left mid-fight, unless your team is cohesive and understanding of how everything works. You have to be so on the same page that I don't want you guys to just suddenly try to start planning mid-fight too often, you know? Like, you have to get to know each other better. And this doesn't mean never do it, because you'll never get to know how you haphazard call mid-game if you don't start doing it. But there are more fundamental things that I think you can get down and learn about each other first, like planning before a fight, just watching each other for tendencies and stuff like that. Anyway, to get back to the main point, tanks go here first, and then they can move up here and then push through courtyard, using each of these short walls as kind of like a piece of cover to recharge and reload, and also as a space to threaten from, right? So if you're holding at Lion and they start to collapse in on your DPS and supports in the food court, you could come in behind them as a Reinhardt and to cleave damage. The Zarya has space behind the shield. And you can kind of use that space that they've pushed forward to expose their stretch out defense, maybe push into their back line, depending on the kind of, you know, status of the game. Like if Zarya is high charge and the enemy Rein pushes forward, Zarya sees Ana over to the right, then Zarya can just go eat the Anas. Anyway, DPS and supports, once the tanks move forward, you're going to want to follow this similar transition. So while you don't have to follow the exact same pathing, this is going to be specific to some heroes. You're going to want to take different peaks and angles. Like Junkrat could just lob over the wall, so he could just walk straight from cover to cover without ever exposing himself. But a McCree is going to have to sidestep and kind of maneuver himself left and right. But you can use these same checkpoints as well, so that your tanks don't have to utilize so many resources to protect you, right? This is a game of resources and a game of min-maxing your time. And in a situation where you're forcing your tanks to dedicate more resources to you than the enemy DPS, even if you're hitting all the shots, you could be the reason that your team is losing because of things like this. So you can follow this transition. Another way to get through is to utilize this high ground space. Generally, you want somebody, one tank and one DPS, just an off tank maybe to protect the DPS, or a pocket support up here with the DPS. So the DPS can have a different sight line to put pressure into the enemy backlines and force them to move based on kind of like positioning. The reason you want a pocket support or the off tank to be up here is because, let's say if the enemy team has a diva or somebody who could spam this area out, a lone DPS isn't going to be able to hold their own and kind of like take this space and spend any time in it. Even Soldier with his healing is going to eventually have to leave if a Sigma is spamming him or something like that. The range is just too ideal for a Sigma if a Sigma was holding choke, and the damage is just too high. So you really want somebody like a Mercy or a Zen to be up there with them. Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me. So that they can utilize the space properly and hold it for more than 2 seconds without dying while your team pushes forward. Everything has to be as cohesive as possible, right? So even in this instance, you want your tanks moving forward. So let's say if your tanks took a foothold in this space back here, maybe you were starting from here, or maybe you're, once you get here, you want to tell your DPS that they should be moving in now, because you want your McCree, or let's assume it's a McCree, I guess, or like you want your DPS on that high ground to be pushing forward at the same rate as the rest of your team. This will make it so that the enemies have to make a decision that leaves them no time to kind of weigh the pros and cons. You see 1 and 2 walking you at you at the same time. Which one do you go after? One of them's the right answer and one of them's the wrong one. And if the enemy team doesn't know what's the right answer beforehand, it's likely that they'll just crumble. So let's get on with this map now that I've told you a bit of the kind of just like map details and stuff like that. I hope you guys have been able to kind of like watch some of these. I know I haven't put a ton of them out, but I haven't seen a ton of views on the clips that were up there so far, and I haven't heard any questions, so I'm not sure if anybody's confused at where to find the information, or maybe they just you know, have listened to it or watched it and it's not showing up on my end. I'm not exactly sure how it all works. It's kind of my first YouTube channel.
3, 2,
so yeah,
1. Round 1. Capture the objective.
I'm mostly just gonna watch from this angle just because it's easier. So no scouting off of the start. Scouting would simply mean for alerted that he kind of brought his wrecking ball into the enemy's kind of like lion statue type positioning, because he'd be able to roll out again, but from there he'd be able to tell the team what was going on. Wrecking ball is actually so fast that if the enemy doesn't have a Lucio, he can go to where the sim TP'd from, like that initial TP point under or near food courtyard, in order to kind of just like scout from there, because he could get there before the enemy team can if they don't have a Lucio, especially since you have your own Lucio that provides speed boost at the gate. So scouting is very important, especially on these maps, because losing first possession can be kind of important sometimes. So they drop onto the point and you guys are doing your thing. Now if you notice, the enemy team seems to have a majority control of the point, but their biggest problem is that their DPS is too far to the side and their supports are being split by a wrecking ball without anybody properly responding. And I think this Mei is actually turning around to try to respond, but because this because the Symmetra is off to the side, it's requiring the Zarya to make a decision. Does she help her supports out, or Jesus, sorry, or does she save the Symmetra? So this kind of puts strain on the enemy team, because in a normal situation the Zarya would just be able to save the supports without the Symmetra being even a thought, but because she's pushed too far to the side, it's going to be a little bit difficult, and one of them is just going to have to lose out on that. So let's see, now you guys are a little bit split, and I think this is a matter of having two off tanks. Vel doesn't really know where to go in order to be a main tank, and the difference between a main tank and an off tank in terms of positioning is that the off tank doesn't have to be in as scary as a position usually as the main tank. As a main tank or learning, you should feel fear. You should be afraid of what you're doing. It should feel terrifying. Now, if you don't feel fear, there's a quite large chance that you're being too aggressive. Because people generally who don't feel that fear and don't feel that trepidation tend to not know when they've gone too far, so they tend to go too far, you know? But off tanks can generally hang back a bit. They want to be looking at the main tank with the main tank in front of them, so it's more of a tendency for off tanks, or people who play off tanks more often than main tanks, to be a little bit further back than they need to be. So you see that Vel doesn't really have any significant positioning here, and this means that your team has to scramble to use cover and try to fight into the enemy in small ways, while Vel tries to kind of establish positioning. And again, Vel backs up, whereas there's no space on the point, there's no forcing, half health with both supports up, and Vel doesn't feel confident enough to step forward. Now this, like I said, is probably a factor of Vel being more of an off tank, but it is probably also a factor of a lack of support, or a lack of trust in the support's ability to heal them through all forms of damage. So support should really kind of be positioned in an area where they can watch the tank's health, but also still have impact on the enemy team in terms of damage, right? So as a Moira, you should be able to play behind Vel's shield and next to Vel, but you want to definitely be able to have both the enemies and allies in line of sight as much as possible. In terms of Lucio, you want to utilize that wall riding to try to get a little bit of height. And if the enemy is poking you out too much and you can't get that height, then you want to alter your playstyle to play a little bit more behind the shield. And just spam in. You don't have to go for kills as Lucio, just your damage is supplementary to the rest of the team most of the time, especially at lower elos. So good first pick onto the Symmetra, one of the bigger picks, seeing that she keeps the turrets tempoed. But it looked like throughout you didn't even kill all of the turrets, and maybe that turret wasn't really affecting the team as a whole. But really the space wasn't taken, the problems weren't taken care of in terms of like the Mei is a big threat. Symmetra is a huge threat. Mei is probably just as big, if not larger. Once you take care of Sim's turrets and maybe her teleporter, she becomes a lot less useful. So it can be important to make sure you prioritize the right targets. And threat is based on team-wide, right? So if you're playing a McCree and the Mei is an threat to you, but you have a Reinhardt and the Reinhardt is terrified of the Mei, then the Mei is a huge threat because they are threatening your team stability as a whole. If there is a Reaper next to that Mei, and the Reaper is a threat to both McCree and Rein, then Reaper then supersedes Mei. And I'm not saying that Reaper is more of a threat than Mei to DPS. I'm just saying, I was just using it as an example, maybe a poor example that doesn't help my point get across as well as I'd wish it to. But if you can just understand that you have to understand the collective threat, right? Who is a threat to our team's integrity as a whole, rather than just to me, is very important. So this is a fairly decent positioning on point of our team right now, because we're taking courtyard. We're using both of these kind of doorways to make the tanks have to cover two different positionings. And I apologize again. Boopery went on a little flank and it wound up not working out, which is kind of the risk you take with flanks sometimes. But what I think winds up happening sometimes in the middle of a team fight is there's no micro plays being made. So let's see, does Vel have... Oh, Jesus. So Vel throws pull out, and it's not a terrible pull because it gets a decent number of people and it's going to swoop them all into one point, which is very nice and all. But because it wasn't called, nobody can take action on it, and therefore all the pull is doing is making people annoyed. It's almost like poking people. You just poked people, Vel. That's all you did there. And while it's very nice and dandy that you annoyed the enemy team, it doesn't make them dead. And we want to make them dead. So pulls should be kind of like a trigger for a micro play sometimes. And you do want to pull to annoy people sometimes, get them out of your personal space, make sure that they're not getting too close to certain people. But you could also do things like pull the Baptiste out of Immortality Field very specifically in order for one of your DPS to utilize it. You could be using the pull to, like after Immortality Field goes out, pull the Moira forward or the Sim more forward so that the DPS can capitalize on it. But what this requires is an understanding of how pull works and the call out of the pull being used, right? So DPS, you have to know that when pull is being called, it means that people are being put in a set trajectory, so that you can land easy shots and quickly confirm a kill. So Vel, what you should be doing in the future is when you're playing Orisa, call I'm pulling, or I'm pulling in 2, or I'm pulling in 3. Generally, you want to say I'm pulling a little bit before you actually pull, because you don't want to, you want to give your DPS time to actually respond. The Monkey is in a great spot right here to be able to respond, and this is one of the tendencies that I was talking about, where Monkey is frequently in a decent position to respond to callouts, but no one is making the callouts, and this is an indictment on the team and Monkey as well, because Monkey could also be asking for these resources. It's not just a one-way thing, right? The team doesn't have to call out and have Monkey respond every time. Monkey could also be asking for them. As a side note, Monkey, if you want to call these things out and ask for resources, it's best to first ask, do you have? Because if you just say, can you pull, or like, hey, pull in 3, the Orisa might not have it. Like, if you said pull in 3 right now, not realizing that Vel had pulled, assuming some things, of course, but if you had done so, then Vel would have been like, no, 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 and it would have disrupted comms for no reason, and it would have kind of impeded the flow of thought in a way. Because then you would have had to backtrack and say, wait, Vel doesn't have it. Okay, what now? Because you are already probably in motion. If you say, can you pull in 3, 2, 1, you're probably already walking forward, and Vel's probably already like, wait, fuck, I don't have it. Now you're dead, loser, because I couldn't pull to keep you alive to make the play. So there are a lot of kind of like base understandings, right? Like, let's say if Brunick had gone in there and been able to boop May, right? If Brunick had gone in, or let's say boop Bap, let's say Immortality is down, and Brunick goes in there and says I'm booping Bap, right? What does that mean for the team? What should you do in response to that? Because Brunick should not have to say, I'm booping Bap so that you could do the specific thing in reaction to what I'm doing. The understanding that Brunick is booping the Baptiste should be enough for the DPS, tanks, supports, whatever, to know what to do in response to that, right? So let's say if Brunick wanted to make sure that Baptiste was confirmed kill. Let's say Baptiste is a little bit lower, and he throws his Immortality field, and he's only staying alive because of that. Brunick could very well boop Baptiste up or back out of the Immortality field, because Baptiste is towards the back of the Immortality field, and Monkey could hard dive in with someone, or like really go hard on the Baptiste for a second to try to confirm the kill, because Monkey understands that if Baptiste is being booped and Baptiste is low, Baptiste will no longer be an Immortality field, and that's an easy kill. There's a lot of implicit understanding that comes with using comms, and some of it becomes very confusing, and it kind of can differ from person to person, because everybody can have their own understanding of how to utilize each tool. The pros have synergies and stuff like that that work out because they understand how their team likes to use each tool, right? They know that Bumper says I'm going in, and that means he's charging in, so they know how to play around that as a team. In compared to, let's say, when Gesture says he's going in and he's just going to take 2 steps forward and swing, you know, like it's a different type of going in, and you just have to understand what these call out means for one another and kind of talk about like how you like to utilize each character. You all have your own play style, and you need to just learn each other's play style and learn how to play around each other's play style. And that's why people who work together well is often can kind of be figured out before they've even played together for too long, right? Like Monkey has a specific playstyle, like I was saying, where he's always in position. So if we pair him with somebody who's maybe a little bit more proactive, like if we have Monkey and Alerted together, then I know as long as we get Alerted to calm the right way, that Monkey might be able to learn how to capitalize on the plays that Alerted makes with his ball. And then, you know, we have a little bit of a synergy there. But that's also time, practice, and such. So let's talk about flanks now. Flanks, bro. So a lot of times people go on flanks like this, and this isn't a terrible flank because you're in good position, nobody's turned around, and you're able to chip in damage kind of as nicely as you'd like. But flanks can be a little bit of a tease for most DPS players, because when you're in these positions you think that you can get easy picks, and true, if you performed this execution perfectly, you'd be able to get very easy picks, pop off, and win the fight. But what winds up happening is because your team isn't engaging at the same time that you're going in for the flank, that the enemies are able to actually engage with you and kind of like kill you, you know? So part of a flank is also knowing that the enemy team's attention has been taken away from you. So part of a flank is working with your team. You can be on the flank. Oh my god, there's a clip of Decay on the Dallas Fuel for those who don't know, and he's sitting in the enemy backline on Volskaya Point B, and he's just walking around. He's looking at them. The enemies are there. He could Zen gets half. His team is poking. They haven't engaged yet. Zen gets half on the enemy team. He looks at him, doesn't go in, doesn't try to finish him yet, because Decay knows that he will get his maximum value once his team engages, and he utilizes the lack of attention towards their backline in order to actually execute more than just a Zen. He can get more value in the long term by waiting. So if you had waited a little bit and told your team, and this is again an understanding of how team play works and how you could work together, if you had said, I'm on the flank, or if you had planned before, okay, Echo's gonna go on the flank, tell me when you're pushing, then once everybody pushes in, Echo can come in, utilize that space and lack of attention on the back line to execute people while having time and a lack of resources on kind of like the back line and stuff like that, or even the DPS. You know, you could even poke at the Symmetra and not even kill her, but the fact is that while your team is pushing in, Boop, they can't really focus on you. And if they do, even if you do die at that point, then your team has an easier time, because then they're fighting a fight where somebody's not focusing on the front line or the tank's resources, allowing the tanks to push further, spend more time in spaces that makes the enemy uncomfortable, and do more with what they have, you know? Okay. So nothing is really going to happen here, because this flank, although great positioning and great timing, is just done without pushing, and nobody's really trying to do anything for each other. Everybody's just playing their characters independently of one another. Beat comes out, this is one of the things too, is making plays can be a little bit tricky. Using beat to help your team engage is not exactly making a play. It's using a resource to help push your team forward that is unnecessary, right? You could have used this beat for something else if your team just simply pushed forward and used their support resources, aside from beat, in order to tempo up the tanks, right? If, let's say, the tanks had gone in during coalescence being focused on the tanks means that the tanks can use less resources to move forward, can push the enemy team into spaces that they don't want to be in. Let's say if the enemy, as a tank, you move forward. As Orisa, you can pull everybody together into this back corner and kind of funnel them into this door by keeping your shield in front of them and constantly repositioning so that they can't get onto your left and right of your shield as much as possible. Shield dancing is very important a very important technique for times like this. So this beat helps your team engage, but it's unnecessary, you know, and higher level teams will notice the lack of resources that your team has, right? But this is our tier 1 team, T1, tier 2, blah, 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 blah. And you're able to capitalize because at the end of the day, you're able to out-mechanic them, and your understanding of how your hero works specifically on a one-to-one scale, like Lucio to Lucio, Zarya to Zarya, whoever to Moira to Moira, is just better, you know? Sorry, my window's open and I have allergies, but it's really hot, so I'm getting really stuffy as I do this. So this is what I was saying in terms of where you want to play. Mercy Booty wants to play up aggressive. We've already kind of identified that Mercy tends to want to be a little bit more dually and a little bit more far forward, but in this instance, it's not a bad thing, right? Sometimes the people who are too aggressive happen to be in the right spot. Sometimes the people who are too passive also happen to be in the right spot sometimes. But generally, you want to be playing together at the very least. Like, that's the minimum thing you want to be doing, and this is not what's happening. So if we play point, it has its disadvantages, like we talked at the beginning of the VOD. But if you play choke, it has its other disadvantages, like being able to be repositioned around in different ways and stuff like that. But generally, as far as I understand, and we can have discussions, I'll have discussions and debates about it with anybody if you'd like to talk about it, this choke, to me, is the better hold point for teams as a whole. So now we're giving the enemy team space to work with because we didn't hold. And now they're just allowed this free TP. So if we had held forward, and this, of course, is only proving my point, but sometimes situations just happen out that way. And, you know, I could be wrong under other situations. But under this situation, we could already see that holding ahead at this choke that we're looking at near food court would have been more advantageous because they wouldn't have been allowed this easy TP. They would have been taking damage all the way through. You could have split them. And let's say if they get the TP over your head, that's something that we could talk about micro plays and how to figure out how to play into sim TPs and stuff like that, right? Like, these are things that we can kind of talk about. We could also talk about if you played point more defensively. Let's say if you lose this fight, how could we play around sim TPs and playing more defensively? People are dying. The enemy team doesn't really have the ability to out-mechanic you. Grab is thrown out there. Doesn't really matter. You hunt down everybody. Good to go. So during downtimes, you should really be choosing as much of this time as possible to kind of communicate things beforehand, right? So you want to be talking about things you could improve on if you have to. If you lost a fight especially, you want to say, okay, what was the biggest problem there? Maybe your supports are saying the Pharah's annoying them. Maybe the tanks are saying the Reaper's closing too much space. But you basically have to find out, okay, what was our biggest problem? And then you have to try to figure out how to resolve it as quickly as possible. So if, right, somebody else voices a problem and you have no problem, then you should be spending your time trying to resolve their problem, because you can have impact by trying to alleviate another person and giving them more space to work with, right? If you're a DPS and you're walking forward and you're shooting the shit out of everybody, nothing's wrong for you, nobody's giving you a lot of issues, but your supports say the Pharah is bothering you, then as a DPS you should spend your time then poking down the Pharah, because then the tanks will get more healing, they'll take more space, you'll be able to get more resources going forward, you'll put the Pharah on the back foot, which would be giving you the same amount of kind of like input and impact as you were having before, except now you're making space for your team and stuff like that. That was a side point. I get sidetracked a lot, I'm sorry. But the main thing is that you want to use this downtime to do several things, right? First, hold the back button. You want to be constantly scouting what the enemies are doing. So you should know before you even look at them that they have a Mei or a McCree instead of a Sim. And that should change how you play. Boop can't fly into the sky anymore, and he should know that before he face checks into that McCree and potentially gets 2-tapped, right? So holding the back button is very important. Even if nothing changes, you have to get used to being able to hold that back button, scout the enemy, see what they're doing. If nothing changes, expect the same thing, or maybe see how you could demolish them easier or earlier, or see how you might have to alter around their playstyle depending on what they swap to. 2. Ult tracking, not a huge thing right now, but if you can say, I know this person has ult, it can change how you play, especially for things like Grav, Shatter, Beat. Now with Echo being in the game, Echo ult changes how your team wants to play, because now you have to be prepared for somebody being hyper aggressive all of a sudden, and that just kind of like is an awareness thing. So if you can, and you know for sure, and don't be afraid to say maybe, but if you know for sure, then you 100% want to say it, right? You want to say who has ults and like on the enemy team and what you could do. You also want to plan. Sometimes you want to say, okay, we're going to hold this ult, we're going to hold this ult, we're going to use this ult, we're going to use this ult, right? Right now you have Coalescence and Bongo. Okay, I want to use Bongo. Let's use Bongo early so that everybody can get their ult charge up, or let's use Coalescence in reaction to their Coalescence, or let's try to not use any ults so that we have more ults for the next fight. That's called the dry fight, where you don't use any ultimates so that you can potentially have more ultimates for the next fight. But you really want to be using this downtime as effectively as possible in these different ways: scouting the enemy team, calling out ultimates, planning what you want to do. Those are the 3 main things that you want to do, right? And then of course you always want to get into good positioning and heal everybody up. Those are kind of like automatic things you should be doing. You shouldn't have to take effort to kind of get into the right position. Those things are things that you see people not doing in silver and gold. You guys should be able to get into the right position a little bit quicker. If you're not sure what the right positioning is, then this is what these VODs are for, and I hope that you'll ask questions for multiple maps, right? Because if you ask questions, I'll spend more time on this stuff. I'll make more time for this stuff based on your questions, but I'm only going to engage with what I see right now and then do small supplementary things as I go. Because I can't assume that you don't know anything, right? So I have to assume that you have some information. So I have to learn what you don't know and then tell you what you don't know. So downtime, you should know about the McCree. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, I don't know. I made the list, try to keep it in mind. Good picks, you're better than the enemy team. Lol, Lamau. Bad flank, because again, your team wasn't engaging, but this time your team is very far back and the enemy team is ready to take advantage of that situation. supports, generally you win the support battle, assuming you don't have an ultimate that you have to counter. Like, let's say Beat is going to be the one to counter High Noon or Blizzard specifically. As long as you don't have an ultimate to counter, using your support ult after a mirroring support ult is not a bad thing. Because if you both pop Coalescence, but let's say Bill pops Coalescence 2 seconds later than Ches, as long as nobody dies in that 2 seconds prior to Bill popping his Coalescence, then Bill actually winds up getting more value out of his Coalescence because it'll last 2 seconds longer, technically, than the other support ultimate. And the other support ultimate would have gotten no additional value. So it's kind of tricky to explain, but it's basically like, as long as you're alive at the end of it, it's okay, because you basically just neutralized an ultimate with your ultimate. If you have more questions about that, ask, because I might be able to explain it better if I hear how you ask the question, or if I talk about what part of it is confusing you. Again, you out-mechanic the enemy team. Yeah, you have ultimates to spare, so that's nice. So we're gonna leave it at that for now. And I want you guys to focus on the few things that I said so far. I know there's 2 more maps in that kind of like the Koth map type, or that Koth map specifically, that we could go over in terms of pathing and stuff like that. But you'll notice as we go through the maps and stuff, there will be trends and patterns. You always want to look for checkpoints. You always want to see where the cover is, where the choke points are, where the high ground is, so that you could utilize and abuse it. There's very pattern things. So some of it I want you guys to think for yourself, and kind of like see what your senses tell you as you think about the maps in new ways, and kind of develop your skills along with your kind of knowledge of the game as a whole. But yeah, pathing on that map, you can at least learn what I've told you so far. Downtime, very important, flanking, and kind of like how to utilize each other's resources in order to make plays and stuff like that, and how comm structure can work, are all things that I want you guys to start thinking about and trying to do in scrims and in games. I think you guys have made great progress so far. I really am grateful that you guys have been kind of like picking up some of the stuff. I see when you guys start doing new things that you haven't been doing before. So I really appreciate you guys working with me. But that's all for now. Bye.